John Clark on the channel. Now, he's written a book about Christian Brookner, and oh my goodness, I was sick to my stomach reading about the monsters lurking in that part of Portugal. You would have never took a child on holiday there in your life if you knew about the behavior of some of the people out there, and specifically Christian. I mean, he was the kind of guy, he didn't discriminate, whether it was snatching a kid from a park or a granny would wake up in the middle of the night and he'd be there with a gimp mask on in the corner of a room saying her name, and before he did horrific things. But fantastic writing, John, real eye-opener. I mean, whether people believe he was involved with Maddie or not, just the depth of research he did as to the monsters lurking in that area of Portugal at that time absolutely terrified me, and I was completely gripped. But the link for the book and the link for John's website are all in the description box, folks. And before we get into all this, like I said, I was up till midnight watching the Channel 4 documentary last night. But before we go over all that, could you just briefly tell the viewers, there's probably some new viewers who are not familiar with your work, John, a little bit about you and what got you on this mission, please?
Yeah, good morning, Shaun. I know this is your earliest podcast, apparently, according to one of your comments, one of your viewers' comments. I'm sorry about that. I was up like you last night. You probably were watching Channel 4 Plus One like I was, because I wanted to see the end of the Arsenal game, which was quite interesting. And so it was a late night, and it was interesting to see Channel 4 and The Sun and Rob Patterson doing a good job there, backing up pretty much what 3/4, or no, I should say 99% of the world thinks, which is that this man is very dangerous indeed, and probably in all probability is behind the snatch of Madeleine McCann, and in fact the murder of Madeleine McCann. So it was a late night, and I just to introduce myself, Shaun. I know we've spoken before, but I'm a bit like, one of those sort of rare breeds of journalists that still exist, that I would describe myself as a kind of investigative journalist, although I'm an editor and a publisher. So I spend a lot of my time having to organize other people and spend far too much time trying to run my business, which is increasingly difficult in the age of Meta and Google and these big companies that make it very difficult to do our jobs. But when I do get the opportunity, I love investigating things, and the Olive Press has been now 20 years in Spain, and we've done lots of investigation into lots of different things, whether it's, politicians or corruption or frauds or, sex offenders. And one of the cases that I got thrown into, not actually due to the Olive Press, but due to my previous work at the Daily Mail, was I was asked to go and investigate a little child going missing in 2007 May. It's actually almost exactly 18 years ago that I was called early in the morning. You were probably called early in the morning by your baby. I was called at, I think it was around 6ish in the morning or 6:30 by the Mail foreign desk. I've said it so many times I can't really remember the exact time, but the bottom line is that I was called very early and got on the road quickly and got all the way down to Portugal, and then got dragged into what is effectively the world's largest missing persons case. So yeah, that was it for me, and I've been writing about it and talking about it, and anyone who wants to listen for the last 18 years. So that's me, really.
So there were so many different theories and suspects from the get-go. How did you manage to research and filter and get through all of that?
I think it's a very good question. And I think for people who are interested in the case, and there's many, many millions of them all around the world, there are so many characters involved. And I think what people didn't realize, but if you just look at what the Portuguese public themselves thought back in 2010, that Portugal was a paradise for paedophiles and sex offenders. And you then trace that back through the years, through the kind of famous Casa Pia case, where these orphanages were pretty much set up just to allow very senior paedophiles around the world to come to Portugal and enjoy their holidays, and often with unfortunately with child abuse as part of that. And Portuguese themselves, they voted the highest percentage in all of Europe that they felt that it was a problem that their country was too lax. Now, you only got to go back a couple of years earlier and see what happened in Pradeluge. We've seen the supposed list of 600 paedophiles on the sex offenders list, unofficial sex offenders list, one of whom they claim was Christian Brookner, but I very much doubt that. I certainly doubt they even tracked him down or located him or tried to locate him. He was actually in prison. Not them, but when they tried to find him, he was in prison and they couldn't find him. It was very they were the Keystone Cops, as we now know. And in fact, thankfully, it was the German police and Scotland Yard who've managed to piece the case together as well as they have so far. It's a bit open to debate about whether they'll actually get across the finishing line, but that's a debate perhaps we should have.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that we look at his history because, it really shows what he's capable of. Also, John, we use a code word now for that type of people. We call them PDFs because if we use the other word too much, YouTube suppresses the video. So we're gonna call these people PDFs if that's okay with you. And I know it's
so frustrating. Every day we put a story out. Every day Google it suspends our stories, and I have to appeal it every day. The next day they come back and they accept it. And we had one. This is a ridiculous example of this. We had the Michelin Man at an event in Malaga because they're having the Michelin Awards, this annual Michelin Awards in Spain. In Malaga. And so in the picture, you've got all these politicians, 2 or 3 very famous chefs. And in the front, you've got this big fat Michelin Man. And they blocked it for gross content, for unfair, for fattest content or whatever. You're absolutely right. So PDFs, I'll try and remember that. Yeah. That's the latest. Right. We have the same problem. We can't say sex offender in a headline. We can't say rapist. If we accuse someone of rape, it gets cancelled, the story, by Google, and we have to appeal it. And it's
we say instead of that now we say it's the same on YouTube. We say the R word now. He's done the R word to her, or he's R worded her, something like that. Yeah,
it must be difficult. Because in a crime podcast, it must be very hard.
It is, but we've learned over the years just to adapt to it, and all the viewers are hip to all these words as well now. So we actually have a code word sheet, but it's terrible that you can't talk frankly about these monsters to shine a light on them properly, and it's kind of insulting to survivors that we've got this algorithmic strangulation forcing us into this corner. But let's go back to Christian B then. So, what was his upbringing like?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you absolutely say, and I have been cautious about using the word monster, for example, but The Sun have always very famously called him a monster. And as we've seen last night, and as we saw from the recent trial where admittedly they threw the cases out, although it's on appeal, he basically wrote a series of very gross stories about fantasies that he had as an adult, one of which was read in the court as a mother-daughter fantasy of snatching, kidnapping, using ether, to knock the victims out and then to take them to his paradise where he would get away with horrible things. Now, I going back to his upbringing, he obviously had a very tough upbringing. He was adopted. His first name was Fisher, and he was adopted by a couple along with 2 other boys, and he was treated very badly. There's no doubt about that. He was locked in the cellar. He was beaten. He was sexually abused. He had a very difficult upbringing. There's no doubt about that. Nonetheless, it doesn't excuse the fact that from the age of 14, 15, 16, he was sexually assaulting children. The age of 17, he was in court. And on one occasion, there were 2 young children that he snatched. One girl he dragged into a bush, and another child who he actually followed into the garage of his own house to abuse. And one of these sexual assaults took place exactly 1 week before his trial. So knowing he was going to trial for 2 cases, he went and did it again, 3rd time. So this is a guy who knows no bounds, who's fearless, has always thought he can get away with it. Now, he did get a slap on the wrist that first time, but he didn't get very long inside. And although the German police clearly wanted to keep tabs on him, he was able to get out to do this mechanics course while he was serving his sentence. And before he'd actually served his sentence, he upped and left and went down to Portugal. This is one of the things that that they didn't get correct last night. He arrived in Portugal in '99 in Pradeluge and settled there around the area with a girlfriend actually at the time. And it seemed, he seemed to all intents and purposes, people who knew him then, who I've spoken to, and some were in the book. And by the way, we are republishing the book. I should point that out. I've got a publisher in London who's republishing the book with a new intro, and I know there will be in a year's time, probably when the trial ever happens, there'll be a much more in-depth book. But he clearly had, right from the start, criminal tendencies, and it just went from there. And I think the police catalogue 17 convictions. He's currently in prison for rape from R. Sorry, I think it's really important that people know the background to this guy, and if he does ever get out, and supposedly, I don't know if you read the Mirror this morning, but I published an exclusive story along with the Olive Press about how there are some more court cases that they're throwing at him coming up next week. In fact, one for assaulting police officers. And so they are going to be putting as much spokes in the way to prevent him getting out September the 18th. He will at least serve at least another 6 months to a year, I'm told. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, extremely brazen and dangerous, as we saw, with the kid in the park. So it seems to me there was a pattern of leniency towards him and his ability to just evade justice by going to different jurisdictions. Do you think they should have been more severe on him from the get-go?
I think it's really difficult in a federal Germany because they've got, I think it's 15 or 16 different regions, and they're very standalone regions, and they all have their separate police forces. And he cleverly worked out that he could just move between these different regions, and it was very hard, therefore, for them to monitor what he was up to. And to make things even more complicated, and this was explained to me by the prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters, every time he moved to a new province or federal province, he went to Spain or Portugal in between. So he'd go to Portugal for a year or two, and then he'd go back to Germany, but a different region. So to keep tabs on him was extremely difficult. Then you've got to remember that he also spent time in certainly Eastern Europe, certainly times in Italy, time in Austria, some time in Holland, moved around. He was a drifter. So you never really knew. It's very hard to keep tabs on him. Very hard, especially with Schengen, where you can move around Europe freely, and they're not monitoring borders anymore. So he was a difficult person to keep tabs on, and I think it's fair to say the Portuguese police, quite frankly, didn't give a stuff. And I think it's the slow realization is coming that they may have to face the truth that they allowed a very dangerous sex offender and potentially, shall I say, serial K. I don't know if you're allowed to say that or whatever, but could have been someone who killed a number of people in their borders and didn't monitor him properly. So I do think it would be, they should have monitored him more closely if they could, but it was very difficult.
So was it the lack of enthusiasm for the police force to go after these people that caused PDFs to gravitate towards Portugal during that era?
Yeah, I think it was seen as the perfect place to go, where the police really weren't interested in that as a crime. I mean, I think in my book, I wrote that in 2008, after Maddie went missing, you could be sitting in a cafe in a village somewhere in Portugal with your laptop open, watching child's pee, and you couldn't be caught for that, watching it, and so it was very lax. And of course, Spain, which had been the Wild West when we arrived here in sort of early 2000s, had been pretty wild, and a lot of stuff. The police really started cracking down in Spain, and of course, a lot of these kind of travelers and people who are up to no good moved across the border to Portugal, because there the police force was worse paid than Spain. They had less policemen. It was just as rugged and hidden. And he was able to sort of, these sort of new age traveler societies, these kind of van lifer types. He was able to drift in and out of these communities, basically selling drugs and doing odd jobs. There were times when he would settle down a bit with a girlfriend, and we now know he rented this house for, let's have a look, for 7 years. He lived just outside Pradaluz in this little house and of course he desperately didn't want anyone to find it. So when he was arrested, he gave different addresses, said he was living in his van. But he could blend into the community there and find like-minded people who wanted to do the same things as he wanted to do, which was, PDFs.
How was he able to sustain himself, and how did he purchase the creepy structure, the property that they showed us, where the swimming costumes are found of the kids?
Well, that's interesting. That was we saw that last night, and that's something new that came out. I mean, I don't know what your take was on the documentary. I felt like the narrative was generally good. It tried to explain as best as possible why the police think this guy's guilty. I can tell you now, there's a lot more that didn't go in that documentary. Stuff that they did know, but they couldn't put in, and stuff that they didn't know. But I think what's particularly interesting was some of the photographic and video evidence that we saw from the box factory that he owned in MOVEeClips, which was the converted box factory in East Germany. He bought in 2008 for 22,000, I think it was, and he wanted to sort of turn that into a kind of sculpture garden, creative art project, or whatever it was. But that's where he effectively stored, I think at one point, nearly 20 vehicles, which the police, by the way, took lots of them, a lot more than people realize, off the land, and obviously scoured for DNA and whatnot. But in the photos we saw last night for the first time, we saw the burial site where he buried his dog, Charlie. And underneath the body of Charlie was this plastic Aldi bag, Lidl bag, full of stuff that he'd hidden. And I think we saw for the first time a photograph of the 6 USB sticks and 2 memory sticks were on there. There were lots of photos and stuff that he shared, and his fantasies, and even an autobiography that he was writing. And of course, you also saw the 75 children's swimming costumes. A lot of them were in his Winnebago. You also saw the children's bikes, little toys. I mean, I've been around that place 3 times now, and there's still lots of evidence of bits and bobs they hadn't taken. And I do believe there's, that's some of it there. I do believe there's a lot more stuff there that they possibly didn't find. I'm told they did find it, because not only did they spend 3 days there initially, the 2016, they went back again. The BK Bundeskriminalamt in Wiesbaden, who were running the investigation, they went back and had a very, very good look at it again. Obviously, they told me they properly scoured all the tunnels underground, and this was somewhere that Brookner loved. It was his fantasy, these underground tunnels, this sort of former, what I believe could have been some sort of concentration camp. And I think that, he loved the fact that he could store all his cars there. And I'm pretty sure that some pretty nasty things happened there. People who went there, visited, said that it had a very sinister atmosphere when he was there. And it's clearly, the money he got from that, interestingly, came from a robbery, a burglary of a house where he took 100,000 euros. And he was a very prolific burglar, so he was often taking. There's the mask, you see. Now that's the mask that they found, but also there are photographs we've seen for the first time where he put on Photoshop some masks onto him naked when he was standing by the Irade Lake, where of course the police searched, if you remember, 2 years ago in Portugal. And some of these photos where he's naked, and often he has an erect member, very odd photos that he took. I don't know, I think he took a lot of himself, but I don't know who took them. That's a fascinating idea to know who might have taken them, actually. But in these pictures, he's actually mapped up a black balaclava onto his face to show what he would look like if he was, say, attacking a victim. And of course, we know that he attacked various victims. He's in prison now for 7 years for the R of a very old, unfortunately now passed away pensioner, American pensioner, and he wore a mask like the one we just seen. And that mask also was the one he wore when Hazel Bean was raped as well. And she's convinced that she saw him. You heard in court, she said, went to court bravely, gave her evidence. She's absolutely certain, and I believe, completely believe her, that that he's the man who raped her. His piercing blue eyes. She also saw on his leg a mark, which has now come out and been proven to be the case. But yet, for some reason, the judge in that case decided there was no mark and there was no reason to look at the marks or photos. Again, at the box factory, they found a suitcase, which I don't know if you've seen that picture. There was a suitcase, and in that suitcase was very weirdly, according to Rob's testimony last night, he said there were lots of photographs of children, girls, I think mostly, and oddly some phone numbers, a great bunch of phone numbers. They didn't say. I don't think Rob knows who they, and in fact, I don't think he's got phone numbers, but the police obviously have those phone numbers. I don't know if they're for mothers of children, or I don't know, or for paedophile or PDFs or whatever it is. I don't know if they're. Again, this is something that I'll be exploring more over the coming year or two, and I do think this case isn't going to be closed anytime soon, Shaun. But I do think we're coming towards the end game.
Could you explain the significance then of the insurance document?
Yeah, that's right. Well done for getting all this stuff, by the way. So yeah, this is interesting. This is very interesting. So this is something that I do know about. It's not in my book, but it will be in the next one. And this links to you may have read that in my first book I published that he attended the so-called Dragon Festival in Orcava, which is in the Alpujarras Mountains of Granada, not far from the Costa del Sol. And this festival is where basically, effectively, the world's New Age travelers go and party for what used to be about 2 weeks. They'd arrive a week before and then they wouldn't leave for a week afterwards. And the police just didn't know what to do. So they just sort of let them stay there. And if you see the photographs of this event, it's staggering, because it's sort of, as far as the eye can see, wall-to-wall caravans and Winnebagos. I mean, it looks like a sort of gypsy festival, like the Apple, what's it called? What's that fair they have in England where they all go, the horse fair, Appledore horse fair, whatever it is, but for kind of New Age travelers. And everyone had a sound system, and they were pumping out sound all the way through the night till 6, 7, 8 in the morning. I remember Chris Stewart, who lived up there, who's driving over lemons, the Genesis drummer, said all he would hear for like 3 days or 4 days was just bang, bang, bang. Anyway, Christian loved going to this festival and went certainly in 2007 and 2008. And this document here, and of course, what's interesting is one of the witnesses in the case, Helga Bushing, who knew Brookner very well. Helga, bless him, said he's now unfortunately not very well, living in Italy, but he's a decent, really decent guy. And I mean, that's all relative, because he's been in prison lots of times for theft and drugs, so I don't know how decent he is. But anyway, the point is, I believe him when he said that Christian confessed to him that he took Maddie from the apartment, and he told Helga Bushing at this festival, the Dragon Festival in 2008, March. They said last night, April. It was March, in fact, that she had not screamed when she was taken out of the apartment, and Helga clearly saw that as a confession. And Brookner, having realized he'd told Helga this, the look of horror on his face, he immediately kind of freaked out and walked off. And what Helga said in the court actually recently, and we'll say again in the Maddie case when it comes to court, was that he, in the middle of the night, got up and left and vanished, took his Winnebago, and off he went. And so that document you had up there, I'll just quickly explain it, proves that, and he denied he was there, but proves that he was actually at this festival. So at least it backs up Helga's claims. And the document shows that his Winnebago was in an accident with a Porsche a local Spanish-driven Porsche by a woman in a petrol station just coming out in Orkava at the time, and it's got Brookner's signature on it. He's confirmed it. He nudged another car. I think he took off the wing mirror. Certainly scratched the door. I can't. I'll have to check my notes, but definitely that happened at the time of the Dragon Festival. So he was 100% there. And again, I know because we found evidence we think was in his van and him at the year before. So that was just in the run-up to Maddie going missing, being snatched. He was there again because he was traveling around a lot with this Winnebago VW van, and he took it even though the owners didn't want him to. He took it to the festival. So he was a regular there with all these people.
All right, viewers, I am here with John Clark, and he's the author of a book that's absolutely terrified me. Don't read it late at night. It is harrowing about Christian B. And the link for that book is in the description box, as is John's website. So if you've just joined us, I'm going to do a quick poll. Put a 1 in the chat, viewers, if you managed to watch the Channel 4 documentary that was released last night about Madeleine McCann and Christian B. Put a 2 in the chat if you've not yet managed to watch it, just so we can get an idea of how many of you saw it. Me and Jen were up till midnight watching it. John, is it also the case that one of his vehicles had a compartment in it that you could hide a child in?
Very much so. I believe it wasn't just one. I believe it was a number of vehicles that were adapted to carry not just potentially children, but drugs, primarily moving drugs around across borders. Let's not forget that moving from Portugal to Germany and back, he would be going across various borders, and you could, of course, be picked up at any time on a border. So he had to have these compartments. But in particular, he had this one Winnebago, and there was a fascinating chat I had with the father of one of his girlfriends, a woman called Nicole Fellinger, who he was sort of living with on and off. Not long after, well, actually, he met her before Maddie went missing. At Christmas 2006, he had a party, a leaving party from prison, and I don't know whether anything they struck up. They certainly struck up a good friendship. Whether anything actually happened sexually, I couldn't say, but they certainly got a very special relationship. Around the time that Maddie went missing, certainly she'd separated from her partner Matthias, and Christian was sort of moving in on her, and they became very close. It's fairly well documented that while she was there, Christian often turned up in the house where she was obviously living with orphans. She was looking after these orphans from Germany, these poor kids that were brought in who were 13, 14, 15, who had been abused, most of them, or certainly, if not sexually, certainly physically abused, and had difficult upbringings. And of course, they were living in her house, this rather creepy house that she was renting in the hills about 45 minutes inland from the Algarve. And of course, Christian, this is his paradise, isn't it? Children, abused children, he could hang out. So he regularly hung around at this house in Foral. And in particular, he had this big Winnebago, which he again bought from a robbery where he'd made a fair amount of money along with this lady. And again, this is pretty well catalogued. She was brought in for questioning and over this. And he pretty much he confirmed it to a lot of people. He hasn't been prosecuted for it, but his name's been brought into the investigation. And this Winnebago was parked up inside the house in Foral, where these children, these orphans, were living. And what's more interesting is that Nicole went to pick up her dad, Dieter, from the airport in Faro when he was flying over to come and visit her. And so she went to pick him up, and she left her children in the garden with Christian, might have been the house, to play. So he was effectively babysitting her children. Yeah, mind boggles. So anyway, so when Dieter arrived at the house, he said the first thing he saw was Christian and his young granddaughter sitting on the lawn with Christian sort of playing with her on the lawn. Yeah, I know, horrible. And so then he had this very weird conversation with Christian B, or Christian Brookner, where he told him that he had this Winnebago, would he like to have a look around? And of course, Dieter was fascinating, this huge vehicle, and he kind of took him on board and showed him around. And there was a sort of like almost like a dance floor at the back, and there was a circular table, a dining room area, and showed him the bedrooms, and he was very proudly. And they said, "Oh, and I've even got a space that's big enough to smuggle a small child." And it's so he's like, Dieter was like, "What? What did you just say?" So he said it's big enough to smuggle, a huge take marijuana. He told him he smuggled grass in it, marijuana. I mean, he told his potential father-in-law, a father he'd never met, a guy he'd never met before, the father of his then girlfriend, that he was smuggling drugs and had a compartment big enough to smuggle a small child. Now, was that just a slip of the tongue? You have to kind of question, first of all, that he had it. Secondly, that he even said that. And there's the other question, because there were these two agencies that were bringing these children over from Germany. We're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children were coming over at the time to Portugal. You have to question, was he bringing some of these children in his vehicles? Was he working with, because these agencies were dodgy as hell. They got investigated, shut down, fined. It turned out that they were totally unregulated. And so therefore, was he part of the whole operation? I'm told that she was definitely part of it and closely linked to it. But was Christian helping in some way?
So it seems like he was kind of giving clues here and there, like the statements that he dropped, the one you just cited, and also, when he said that Maddie kept quiet. But also, if you've got a load of incriminating memory sticks, why on earth would you bury them under a dead dog? Why wouldn't you just burn them and throw them in the river and completely destroy them? He actually left them intact under a dead dog, which he probably knew that, if they ever brought a cadaver dog out, it would hit on that.
It's really, really interesting point, Shaun. I mean, they do say, don't they, that criminals always like to keep mementos and keep things. And, you just wonder, these are things that he's been working on for a long time. They're obviously close to his heart. We don't know exactly what's on all these things, but I can tell you there's lots of stuff, and it's pretty sickening, a lot of it. And he left things in various places. In particular, unfortunately for him, he left a hair on the bed of his last victim, this 72-year-old woman that he tied up and raped and filmed in the most disgusting circumstances. So he did leave things accidentally and deliberately. Clearly, those things that he left underneath the dead body of Charlie were there because he wanted to work on them again, and he obviously treasured them. Unfortunately, I don't know if you're aware of this, when they raided his apartment, his kiosk in Braunschweig, they picked up a camera and a couple of other memory sticks. And on the camera were some photographs of a 5-year-old girl that he was molesting at the time, who was the daughter of a friend of basically a friend of his daughter, who he molested. And in the photographs, you can see apparently not the most horrific stuff, but you can see he's clearly doing some molesting. And unfortunately, those photographs appeared in the hall that was found at the box factory, at this where they found these memory sticks. And unfortunately, because they tried him over that case with the 5-year-old and found him guilty, and he got 18 months, they couldn't try him for any of the other stuff found on any of those memory sticks, because under German law, you can't use the same hall again. So there's a kind of technicality there. So yeah, I mean, the mind boggles, Shaun. So there may be loads of other kids that he abused, and other people and other kids on those things, but they can't. The police apparently can't prosecute over any of it.
Just what they showed at the box factory was so disturbing. I mean, he had a mattress there, as if that's where he was doing his evil deeds, on this filthy mattress, and then the kids' toys, and then why so many little girls' swimming outfits? Wasn't it like 70 of them?
75.
Grief.
And he also had masks and fancy dress outfits. I mean, if you look at my photos that I got from the book that I took 4 years ago, you can see there's a lot more than mattresses. He had his oil. He collected petrol. He stole a lot of petrol, diesel fuels. He kept a lot of the petrol there. I actually found a couple of what effectively, I'm pretty certain, are shallow graves. that were dug up. I mean, they look like shallow graves. So whether they are is another matter. But they are the exact right length for a shallow grave that they dug up, and they clearly had to have big, industrial tools to pick up the concrete initially. So whatever had been there had been concreted over. So, but it's really interesting. You find these sort of odd shaped. Again, people have to look in the book. They didn't show them last night because I think they've now been filled up. But again, I've got those pictures in my book, and in the next book, I'll be putting the pictures of the circular stone circles that he made at the Arade Dam that I got before the police got there and did their huge search a year ago, thankfully. But yeah, these pictures here, this is fascinating. This is this suitcase that they found. And, again, apparently there were loads of photographs of children in it. I mean, I'm just suggesting maybe looking at it again here. This could be his painting stuff because, he liked art and he did sketches. So it could just be that this is, are those his paintbrushes and his pencils in there, giving him, and it could have been stolen. It could be it looks like it could be an art case almost, right? Until I'm actually in front of the police or with the police and they say, well, they explain it. I can't really say exactly what was in there, what is in there.
So my instinct was that these pictures of girls were girls he was either going to target potentially, or he was fantasizing over.
Yeah, at some point I'll be explaining how he did. There were other people, and there were links to him targeting children, and monitoring them, and exactly. And these these are fantasies and snatch fantasies that he wrote about at length. We heard one in the trial that was read out in the trial, and in the trial, when the British detective, you may have noticed that Mark Draycott gave his evidence. And of course, it wasn't meant to be about Maddie, but they brought in the Scotland Yard detectives and they just said, look, we've got lots and lots of emails that he sent. He tried to delete lots of them, by the way, but he wasn't able to delete the sent file. He in those emails, he clearly says, I'm going to send you this, I'm going to send you that, I'm going to do this and that. He did send lots of child P and other stuff to different people. And they actually announced a bit of this mother-daughter in the trial. They actually talked it through and you heard it came out, what he claimed and what he said. It's horrific. I can tell you now for a fact, there are a lot more of those. And again, at some point I will be revealing that and more of that. But it's not pleasant to watch, Shaun. And you've got a young child now, you've got a baby, and I've got 2 kids. It's the most harrowing stuff to have to deal with. And in a way, this is a bit like some therapy, talking to you and being able to kind of get it out there. And I don't want to talk to my wife about it, Yeah, this is fascinating. So this picture here shows supposedly chemicals. Now, again, I don't know if it's a stretch that they made last night, suggesting that sort of linking it to kind of chloroform. Again, I don't think they have actual proof there was chloroform. I think the police might have it, but maybe it wasn't announced last night. I don't know whether the journalists working on it last night were able to prove that. But these are substances found in the back of the Jag car that he drove backwards and forwards to Portugal and backwards and forwards to Germany. This sort of very dark plum-coloured Jag. And the idea was that, and certainly in one of this sort of R scenario, the mother-daughter R scenario story, he does talk about using ether, I think it's called ether, on a blanket, on a rag, to nullify them. And again, I can't see there, and I don't know because I haven't got the actual full detailed report because they haven't released this. Although you saw a bit of it last night, the photos, we didn't get the full detail of what the police had because they still haven't released that. We don't know exactly what chemicals were in there, but yeah, I mean,
what did you make of the Skype calls then? Because they were hinting that he may have been working with a network of PDFs.
Yeah, well, exactly. That was fascinating. That was a Skype chat that I had in my book that is with a man called Panic Spats, and that man, I can tell you, is an undertaker. And he is, I know. knows how to get rid of bodies, right? I know what you're thinking, but he was linked in and involved with Christian Brookner, and Christian had a handle Holger wants him. I think they didn't have it correctly last night, as I saw on the TV program, but which means madness of Holger, which was his, like, he used the name Holger and this login, madness, mad Holger. And he talks about how he's going to snatch a child, a small child, something small. No, he's going to snatch something small, keep it for days, abuse it. And the other person's saying, wow, how would you avoid it? How would you avoid being caught? And, you know, he effectively says, by getting rid of the evidence. It's chilling. It's horrible. It's in my book, you know, the whole chat. It's horrible. It's horrible. And there are, again, I can tell you again, Shaun, it's if you like, it's sort of exclusive here, that there are many, many more of those, which I hope to at some point, or I hope that it will come out in the trial. I really, really hope that, you know, sometimes in many countries, you can have 30 bits of very good circumstantial evidence that prosecute and put someone in prison for the rest of their life without DNA, without a body. Clearly, it was helpful having his hair in the house of this poor woman, Dinah Menkes. But you know, I think that sometimes if you can place someone at a crime, and they can, if you can work out that that's the sort of thing he's interested in, which they can, if they can say he's done it before, he has. If you can say that there have been conversations about it, there were, then you, most probability-wise, you can convict this person, I think. I mean, a jury would. I'm pretty sure of it. So in Germany, I don't know. I think they're concerned because of the recent knockback from the judge there. But
so you mentioned, you know, disposing of bodies then, and over the years, you must have contemplated how Maddie could have ended up, where she could have ended up, and it kind of showed a map of where they thought how he took her. The dogs traced this path down the street. You know, do you have your own theory as to what happened next?
Well, actually, I'm very happy you asked that question, because I can point out one of the good things about having been working on a case for so long is that you do kind of know the facts, or at least you know 99% of them, or 90%. And I can tell you now that they actually said that the scent went from the apartment. The Portuguese sniffer dogs, supposedly, and again, this is the Portuguese police and the Portuguese sniffer dogs, whatever the conspiracy theorists say, the Portuguese police were not doing a good job. Their police sniffer dogs did not trace her scent down to the church in Pradaluz. They actually traced it to a lamppost just down from where the tapas restaurant was, where the parents were eating that night. So it effectively went, I think, 100 yards or 75 yards, not the kind of kilometer that they reported last night, down to the church, where, of course, he did hang out the church. In fact, I do believe his van might have been parked at the church. And I do believe the Smith man, as they call him, and the Smiths from Ireland who saw this man walking down with the child, I actually believe that was him. Yeah, I do believe that was Christian. But I don't think the police dogs had the scent that went down there. I think his van was there. I think he put her in the van, and I think he took her off. And the police think that she was abused quickly and killed fairly quickly. And probably they think she's at that lake, the Raddy Lake.
What was the relevance of the boreholes?
They were looking for fibers. So they were effectively looking for, so when she was snatched, she was wearing her pajamas. And so they were looking for anything that she might have been wearing, pajamas, or maybe something from the apartment, maybe an item of clothing from Jerry or Kate. And they were trying to basically dig down and see if any fibers of any materials had been. And I can tell you now, they really they analyzed. They did find lots of different fibers, materials, and things. Actually, they found clothing, which is fascinating because that's middle of nowhere in the lake that once had been covered with water. And they really worked hard to try and analyze it, but unfortunately, it's too long, and they weren't able to make a match. They weren't able to get good enough analysis on those on the fibers, the textiles that they found. But that's what they were looking for, and they may have found other things, but I don't believe they did, but I do know they want to go back. I can't say where, but I know they want to go back to a couple of key places. The problem they have is the Portuguese.
Why the problem with the Portuguese?
They haven't been particularly helpful. They've been fairly obstructive right the way through. And the head of the BKA now, sorry, the head of the PJ, the head of the Portuguese police, the PJ, was very close associate of Amaral, who led the investigation at the time, who got taken off the investigation, who we know actually the day that Maddie went missing was charged with covering up a crime of sadistically beating a confession out of a woman that she also killed her own daughter. Now, this is another girl called Joanna, and this is another mad case that if people read my book, they will please come and message me what you think. Joanna, just up the road in Figueras, tiny village just close to Pradaluz, also vanished mysteriously. Strangely enough, the Portuguese police, this is Amaral, Pereira, the same team, same clowns, same units in Portimao, claim that they killed her, their daughter. She killed her own daughter with her brother, and then put her body into guess what? Into a big freezer, a trunk freezer, kept it, and then took it off. And where did they take it? To a farm and fed it to the pigs. Was that the sort of thing that they claimed that the McCanns did? Yeah, anyway, so this poor woman was found guilty, no less. The confession was beaten out of her. He was later found guilty of covering up for his officers that beaten her. And I'm afraid to say that now the head of the PJ is from Lisbon and is linked into the same group of detectives. And they're not really keen, although they've called him an official suspect. He's now an arguido. It's fair to say that, I mean, even before the search in Portugal last year, they'd leaked it out, even though they tried so hard to keep it secret. I mean, they got there, they were so careful, the German police. It leaked out a day before or 2 days before, so that all the Portuguese press, everyone was there, so they couldn't go about their duty. I mean, they don't make it easy; they make it very hard again, I've got some good quotes from Hans Christian Wolters about the Portuguese in my book, and again, I've spoken to him many times since, and other sources connected to the case, and they will all tell you the same thing. It's very, very hard to work with the Portuguese.
So was that the theory they had, the pig theory, when they made the parents suspects that they were later cleared of? And was that, did they have any reason or any justification for making them suspects at that time?
Logic. I mean, logic, right? That normally 75% of children or people are killed by a loved one, a family member. It was logical to look into them. Of course it was. There were supposedly these cadaver dogs brought in that sniffed Maddie's scent in the sitting room behind the sofa. May well have been. I'm told she had a nosebleed as she got off the plane, so there was blood in the back of the car. And also, if you look at the probability, there was so many. It's pretty much discounted, Shaun, and all that. There was a time when the conspiracy theorists went wild, but I think they had to look at them, but they didn't have to charge them. They didn't need to charge them.
So earlier on, you said that there was a lot that the Channel 4 documentary left out. Is that for legal reasons, or is there anything you can elaborate on?
I think you'd need to talk to them yourselves, Shaun. Again, Rob covered the case. He was there at the trial right the way through. I helped the Sun a fair bit with their reporting. I also, as you may have known, helped RTL in Germany, which is one of the big TV networks, and I also worked for the ITV in the UK, setting up and covering the trial for them. I think that Rob did a good job. He travelled around. He went to covered all the bases, and I don't know how much more he's got. I think legally you have to be careful in these cases, but I mean, it's difficult to libel a guy that's done so many bad things, right? I step short calling him a monster as best I can, because I just don't think that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I've reached out to Rob, and we are chatting presently. And so you've got a load of questions have come in. Do you have time to answer some questions?
Sure. What time is it? How are we doing?
All right, so we're about 50 minutes in presently.
Okay, yeah, I'll have sort of 10, 15 minutes more. Is that okay? I don't know.
Yeah, that's perfect. All right, so this one's from SDM. The Channel 4 documentary, and if you've got any final questions, please get them in the chat now. The Channel 4 doc last night, they did intimate that there is something that makes them believe he did take her and unalived her. What, in your opinion, is this evidence they appear to have? I mean, well, this is the biggest question of them all, isn't it? Because that was like the cliffhanger, wasn't it? They've got this evidence, but we can't tell you what it is because they can't tell you what it is. But they're in a race against time now because they've got to do something, or he's going to be released.
It's a good question, and that's the it's the fundamental question that we've all asked in the beginning. What have they got? Why is Hans Christian Wolters quoted as saying he's sure that Christian murdered Maddie and he's the only suspect and the main suspect, and they've got proof of it? I mean, Shaun, you've got to look back a little bit and see that 2 or 3 years ago, the Mccanns changed their whole narrative. They pretty much changed how they were describing it. The police in the UK let slip. I don't know if anyone noticed that in a official request to the UK Scotland Yards about 4 months ago, they announced that it was a murder inquiry. It's no longer a missing person. I think they then corrected, so it is a missing persons, but accidentally they said it was a murder inquiry because it is a murder inquiry. And there is, as they pointed out in the Channel 4 doc last night, they do have other memory sticks, and they said there was a laptop and other storage devices that aren't in that group of pictures we saw. Because the pictures we saw last night were just from the search of MOVEeClips, the box factory in 2016. Those pictures and what they found, that's all from that one search. So we didn't see what they found when they raided his kiosk in 2012, 2013 in in Braunschweig. You don't have any of the stuff that was found in Hanover when they raided there, or any of the other stuff they might have found at any of the digs they've done at other places that he lived. So, and more crucially, stuff that may have come in from Portugal. And I know there is a lot of other stuff. I'm told that there is proof that he killed her, but it isn't DNA, and they haven't got a body, obviously. So you have to work out what you think it is. Is it something he's written down? Is it a confession to somebody else that they haven't? You've got to remember that I think I've spoken to 100, maybe 150 people connected to this case. Now I'm told that the police have spoken to nearly 1,000 people that were connected. So, and that's logical, right? That's normal. And there will be some witnesses, some people that we don't know about, and that have said things that haven't ever come out in the public. I mean, this is what basically Christian Brookner's lawyers want, is the dossier to see. When they present it, they'll then know what the evidence is, and then they'll know all these people, and then they can go and cross-examine them and all the rest of it. So, I can't say 100% here. I wish I could, but I can't.
Yeah, so I immediately thought perhaps he had a photo of something related to Maddie, or he documented a fantasy about her, something like that. And a few people are asking if you think some kind of photo related to the McCanns, that maybe he'd been watching them or something.
I mean, that would be something if he had anything connected to that, or maybe a keepsake or something he'd taken from the apartment, or maybe he doctored or made a picture or something that with Maddie that he said, oh, this is what it was like, or this is what it could be, or do you know what I mean? Or he sort of explained how it happened to someone. You know, I mean, in the trial, you may have noticed, or you may not have noticed, if people towards the end of they introduced a Romanian guy. We haven't talked about him, called Codin, and he was in prison with Christian in Germany for a while, and because he didn't want to say what he was in for, because he didn't really understand, Christian assumed he was a PDF, so started befriending him, and he supposedly told police that Christian confessed to him as well, and asked him very strange questions about how you got rid of bones, how you hide bones, how long they would be around for, and also interestingly told a journalist, and again I can't say too much about this, but basically said, so the journalist has told me, said that he said, I sexually abused her twice before I buried her near to Pradeluge. Okay, now that will hopefully form part of the evidence in a trial against him. Now, whether there's two, because you've got Helga Bushing, whether there's three, whether there's four, whether there's five people that, you know, he might have talked to or confessed to, is that enough to have him convicted for her murder? I don't know, but it sort of indicates, doesn't it? It hints that you know, that it's a very good clue that he probably did it.
It's a shame that they can't show their hand. It's almost as if, like, you know, they're almost there, but if they had something so concrete that you'd think they would be forthcoming, but they said on the documentary they can't show their hand until they've got it all together. That was kind of the impression I got from the documentary. All right, so the next question is from Magoo. I remember this narrative 10 plus years ago. I thought it was him at the time. So why was he released as a suspect?
That's interesting. That Magoo must know something that we don't if it's 10 years ago, because I think 10 years ago would have been 2015, right? Unless I'm in the wrong year. He was in Braunschweig. He might have been in prison around then for this girl. I think he was talking to some of his friends at the kiosk, joking about how he took Maddie and she was in the basement. The police, it's interesting, in 2014, there was a tip-off and he was asked to go to a police station to explain where he was during those days around May 2007 in connection to Madeleine McCann. They stupidly wrote on the piece of paper, we need to talk to you about the Madeleine McCann case, so that he knew exactly what it was about. In fact, he didn't turn up, but they went to find him at his kiosk to ask him about it. And so he was given, in that time, he could have got rid of evidence. He certainly prepare himself to answer it. He said he wasn't there, which of course he was. So, but at the time they didn't have the phone records that they now have. The phone dropped, knowing that he was definitely there. When they knew that he was definitely there, they were able, that was 2017, they were then able to start investigating. And you have to remember, the German police investigated for 3 years before they did their appeal in 2020, behind the scenes. And at one point they had over 100 officers working on it, you know, for, I don't know for how many months. So they had a lot of man hours looking into this guy. So they clearly saw him as the main suspect and knew that he'd probably done it really early on. I mean, there've been tip-offs since 2007, right after she went missing. There was a critical tip-off putting his name in the ring. That was obviously, the Portuguese didn't do anything about it. They say they went to find him. They didn't find him. They say they went to his so-called yellow house. He wasn't there. I mean, so yeah, Magoo, I'm not quite sure what exactly you're saying narrative-wise, but
you got a few people asking, John, whether you think all of the resources devoted to this case are justified when there's so many kids go missing every year.
And the answer to that is no, clearly not. It's ridiculous. A large amount of money, 13.5 million, and goodness knows how many in Germany. Let's say at least another 5-6 million. How much in Portugal? I mean, the answer, there is a short and a long answer. The short answer is no. The long answer is yes, because simply this brings into the public eye the horrendous crimes that PDFs do and the stuff they get up to, and the pernicious way that they get away with this, and how it's so important for us to be continually aware of the stuff that they do, and how we have to watch our children like a hawk, and how the McCanns have said all along, this isn't about just our daughter. This is about missing children globally. This is about bringing to attention how awful and how disgusting these people are that do these kind of crimes. And, you know, if we solve it, I'd say it's worth double that. If we actually get him convicted and prove it, then it is worth it would be worth 20 million or 25 million. Yeah, of course it would. If you actually can get to the end of this line, then it would be. So far, it's expensive. It does look expensive.
So we're at the hour, and a lot of your questions, viewers, are answered in part one I did with John, which I'm going to play now because I know most of you haven't seen it, and we're going to let John get going.
I look like I've grown a bit taller since then.
I've grown hairier. And is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion, John, before I play part one? It's 45 minutes long, I think.
I don't have to watch it, do I?
No. Is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion to the viewers presently?
No, I really appreciate people that are still interested in the case, and I really appreciate that. I really, really, really love doing my job. I love doing investigative journalism. I'm not scared of some of the implications it brings, the kind of craziness that I've had to put up with over the years. And I believe there's some dangers in investigative journalists. If you were in Russia, or if you were trying to get into Gaza, or wherever, the people who are trying to expose what's happening around the world, I just hope that people value what we try and do and somehow support us in what we do, because it's painstaking and it takes time. And I'm not going to suggest for a second it's as hard or details with a police detective job. And of course, there will always be mistakes we make as journalists and errors and time differences and things. But it's just a body of work, and you just have to keep digging away and digging away and digging away and digging away. And eventually, I hope we get to the end of the line.
Yeah, and if you want to terrify yourself, viewers, with how scary the network was and of these PDFs in Portugal at that time, definitely grab John's book, very well researched. And you would never take a child on holiday there after reading John's book. It really hit me in the guts. And what can people look forward to at your website?
I mean, well, actually, the Olive Press published yesterday an exclusive story about how Christian, unbeknown to The Sun and Channel 4, was actually going to go on trial again next week. So anyone interested in this case will see Mr. Brookner going to court in a small court called Leyte, which is near the prison Sende, where he's been abusing and attacking prison officers, and he's accused of that. And Olive Press, we've been leading the way on the stories in the Mccann case, largely because it's across the road in Portugal, but also because there's been so many cases in Spain, links and connections that he made to Spain. In particular, that crash we saw earlier was in Spain. His many visits to Spain, a lot of his friends based in Spain. So we've been following it right from the beginning. Olive Press is, I think it's the main British English newspaper for expats who live in Spain, and we try and do stuff that people need to know about, and that's it in a nutshell.
And people can find your podcast through your webpage.
Yeah, we're launching a podcast. There we go. Exciting. Yeah, did our first one yesterday. It'll be out soon. It won't be as slick as this though, Shaun, but we'll get there, I hope.
Oh, thank you for spending time with us, my friend.
Thanks
we wish you all the best in your endeavors, and you take care. Cheers, John.
Thanks very much, Shaun. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Paul. Bye-bye. All right, viewers, like I said, there's still several questions outstanding, but I do believe they were answered in part one that I did with John. So, yeah, look at me. Jen's laughing at me looking young and unshaven in this video, pre-Ziggy. So, without any further ado, I'm going to play this for you. It's 47 minutes long, and we've also got some other McCann guests. And we've also got our David Icke on McCann video almost ready to relaunch. So we're going to have much more McCann stuff in the next couple of days. But here you go with part one with John. Let me play this. Viewers requested that we get John on. And John's book is My Search for Madeleine, One reporter's 14-year hunt to solve Europe's most harrowing crime. John is spelled Jon, and it's Clarke, Clarke. All of John's links are in the description box below this video if you want to follow up and get his book. And we've never had John on the channel before, so this is going to be a unique opportunity to get another side to this story that just never leaves the news headlines. So, John, huge thank you for coming on. And firstly, what got you interested in the Mccann case?
Well, I can tell you it's actually 16 years now. It was 14, that's 16, or going into 16 years. And what got me interested in the case was just literally a very early morning phone call told from a foreign desk flunky to just get my ass down to Portugal as quickly as possible and cover a story that seemed pretty low key and pretty minor, but to him it seemed quite important. I think by nature of the fact it could have been a doctor and she could have been blonde and had blue eyes. So that was me, slightly cynical, slightly early in the morning, slightly tired, getting in the car and driving all the way from where I lived at the time in Ronda all the way to southern Portugal, to Pradeluge for my first visit there. And so that's what got me interested. And from that day, I've kind of always covered the case. And always.
When did you notice that this was not a run-of-the-mill disappearance case?
Well, probably, that's a good question. Probably around halfway through that day, I'd say, it began to become a bit like, oh, she's not going to turn up. She's not going to just sort of wander back. We haven't found her body. And I've been like all around that bloody area, all around Pradeluge, you know, every single back street off into the country and talked to everyone I could. And I think probably by mid-afternoon, late afternoon, I thought, no, this is likely to have been a snatch. And, you know, by the time of the press conference that evening, when they famously came out of the apartment and gave their press conference at the steps of the Ocean Club, you could sense their despair. It was exactly 24 hours later. And I don't know if it was timed almost to the moment that Maddie had got missing. It was around 9:15, 9:30 that night. And it must have been almost exactly that time that Maddie had been taken. And they were just distraught. They were, you know, you could sense it. It was just, you know, the atmosphere, you cut with a knife. And it's not, at that point, there's not much you can do. It was on the news, it was on the national news. So there wasn't that much for me to do apart from just to sort of take some pics and listen in and try and get a few pointers. And, you know, I wasn't a crime journalist. I was just a general news journalist, but I had done a lot of crime reporting back in London and in Spain, of course, a lot of crime down here. And so I just sort of stuck around for a few days then and did my best to try and understand as best as possible what had happened. And it was just, you know, I then went back for my daughter's birthday, which was quite moving. She was very young at the time, and then came back out again a couple of days later, or in fact the day after, and then was there for another week more or less, and backwards and forwards really for the first month or two. So yeah, I did lots of reporting on it live in the resort and got to know all the journalists from the very beginning who were covering it. A lot who at the time knew the case much better than me because they were living and breathing it 24/7. But because I'm more of a sort of Sunday news reporter, more, you know, I guess you'd probably say I like following a more exclusive beat, separate beat. I could go off on angles and leads that maybe perhaps the other guys weren't going on because they had to just sort of follow the other sort of daily news agenda. So someone at the Telegraph would have to make sure they followed someone at the Mail, had to follow someone at the Sun. I could be, because I was working for the Mail on Sunday, the Sunday Mirror, I was able to sort of go off a little bit off diary and start digging into stuff that perhaps they didn't. And of course, a lot of them were sent home and then brought other journalists out. So they lost that continuity. But because I've always been in Spain, and because there were so many links to Spain, and it's probably highly likely that Madeleine did come across the border at some point. And because, you know, there's so many stories broke in Spain afterwards, I covered most of those, and we broke a load of our own stories as well, so-called sightings and claims of this and that. So I kept a really close interest in it over the years. And, you know, I always thought I should probably write a book on it. And never did. Wrote another crime book that sold pretty well right at the beginning, and then did a restaurant book, slightly different. And then when suddenly out of the blue, they announced that they had a German suspect a couple of years ago, I got straight on that. I just got onto the Mail on Sunday news desk and just said, look, do you want me on this? And it was in the lockdown, and so they were just delighted I could get straight over there and before anyone else and really, muscle in on it. And at that point, I thought that, this is perhaps the time I should write a book on it. And so I just sort of immersed myself for a year and a half, really just pulling it all together. And I've, I'm going to do a second edition of it fairly soon. There's going to be another edition, and it'll be very different to the first. It's going to be a lot of new stuff. The case, as you probably know, keeps moving and changing. And, I know you've covered it a fair bit. I've seen your name. I've tried to contact you, Shaun, a couple of times. I think we've got mixed up through Donald, a mutual friend, Donald McIntyre. And I know you've been talking to people on the case quite a lot, haven't you? So, someone gave me a blank check. I could probably go to 10 different doorsteps, 10 different areas tomorrow over the next month and carry on digging. But unfortunately, I haven't got the deepest pockets. I can't keep. So I have to sort of wait for the right moment to kind of go off and do my reporting and do my digging. But I think we're getting close. I think we're getting close to solving the case.
All right, well, let's go over this much more slowly then. So on the day in question, would you say there was hope early on and the atmosphere changed?
I'd say there was hope initially, yeah. I certainly hoped, certainly. But yeah, I think it became quite apparent early on that she had been taken. But I think what was interesting was the press conference we had in Portimao a few days later, where the chief of police said, "Oh, look, we know who's taken her," because then they were saying, "Well, it was a kidnapping. We know who's taken her, and she's within." He said, to quote, 3 kilometers, or was it 3 miles of Pradalou. So we thought, what's that all about? How do they know this? And so there was a sort of hope that perhaps she was alive and that we were going to get back. So there was some hope amid the gloom.
Did you ever find out the basis for them saying that?
No, never found out. And I don't know, but as you well know, Shaun, there's a couple of interesting policemen who are linked to this case, fairly senior policemen, one who became one of the most senior, I would say, establishment figures in Portugal, certainly the top 100 key figures in Portugal, who's currently in prison and will be in prison for 7 to 8 years.
Who's that?
A guy called Cristóbal Pereira. He was the deputy of Gonçalo Amaral in the Algarve, and he worked on other missing children's cases and has spoken a lot about Madeleine McCann, has written a book on Madeleine McCann, and became the president of the Missing Persons Bureau in Portugal, the Missing Children's Bureau, no less, not even Missing Persons, Missing Children's Bureau in Portugal, then became the president of Sporting Lisbon, and then got accused then of corruption while at Sporting Lisbon, and then got found guilty of running a crime gang that kidnapped families and children in Lisbon and in Sintra, and is found guilty of running this gang and is now in prison for it, thankfully. I know
he was in charge of investigating these matters that he was committing.
The police over there did, and I can tell you that what's particularly interesting is his connections to sort of the Knights Templar and Opus Dei and shady,
oh my goodness, please tell us all about that. I'm getting goosebumps.
Well, you can write it. There's a bit in my first book. There'll be a lot more in the second book, but I have to be very careful when I go across the border because I don't want to get picked up as I go into Portugal. So I don't know if any of them are going to watch this podcast, but I think, am I right in saying you've been down to Orchiva even at one point? Have you been down to the Alpujarras in Granada, or do you talk to people, didn't you, on your show who were in the Alpujarras?
So we've interviewed Mark Williams Thomas, who was out there quite fast. We've interviewed John Wedge, ex-London Met Cop. We've interviewed David Icke. We've interviewed Sonia Poulton. So we've had a range of viewpoints, from abduction to some kind of abuse ring.
Yeah,
to
the abuse ring
parents.
was interesting. That's I wanted to ask you about that. How do you see that as credible? Did you not find a woman who was based out of Auckland claimed she was trafficked at one point? Am I right in saying? Talk to someone.
We've had every claim under the sun. The people we've interviewed have claimed everything under the sun regarding McCann. The bottom line is, it's one of those things that nobody's ever going to know unless it is solved, as you said earlier. But that's what drives perpetual interest, isn't it? It's like, who killed Epstein? Who killed JFK? These things, the public never lose interest in them because they've not been solved.
I think we are 90% or 95% to solving it. I think when the German police say we are confident that we know what happened to Maddie and that she's dead, and that the family pretty much accept that now, that I think, as I understand it, that the evidence is there. It's not the best clear-cut evidence, but it's good evidence. And there's certain bits that I can't, unfortunately, tell you about because I'm sworn secrecy, that I do know about, that are so good that, unfortunately for Mr. Brookner, he's not going to get off. He will go to court and he will be found guilty of at least, at the very least, abduction.
Well, what was the role of Opus Dei in this? And can you explain what they are?
Well, I mean, it's more Knights Templars and Opus Dei, which is a far kind of quite shady Catholic organisation linked to the Catholic Church. And the Knights Templar were famously come out of the Crusades, when Christian crusaders came down to, fundamentally, people think they all went to Jerusalem, to fight in Jerusalem during the Crusades. But actually, the Crusades were very much linked as well to Spain and Portugal, because from 711 up to 1492, Spain and Portugal and bits of France were ruled by the Moors, the Moorish kingdoms. So it was traditionally kind of important that Catholics, Protestants, knights came down to fight the Arabs in Spain. And so these organizations are celebrated. And I can tell you now that some of the key police figures and establishment figures in Portugal are members of these slightly shady groups. And as you probably know, Portugal has a very bad track record for networks and rings. And at the time of Maddie going missing, there was an extremely serious investigation that had been first seen the light of day 30 years earlier, then been pushed down, and it came up again 20 years earlier and been squashed again, and finally had been brought forward thanks to the amazing work of one of those abused, who became a lawyer, who was just so bloody minded and insisted it had to come out. And that case, believe it or not, at the time of Madeleine going missing, you could still sit in a cafe in Lisbon with your laptop open and look at pornography legally. But in 2008 and 2009, finally came to court, and various senior establishment figures, well over 30, were found guilty, although only, I think, 12 or 13 went to prison. But that included lawyers, TV personalities, doctors, a huge retinue of very senior establishment figures in Portugal. There was even claims that the Prime Minister at the time was linked to it, even one of the opposition leaders, lots of stuff in the press of the counter-suing. So this problem existed. And it's fair to say, would you not agree, that if the lawyers and the medical profession and the judiciary are involved, it's probably likely that the police force is also involved in some way. Some members of them are involved. I think it'd be naive to say, oh no, the police wasn't the police force. That'd be very naive. I'm not blaming. I'm not pointing a finger at anyone here, Shaun. But there've been some cover-ups, and there's been a lot of conjecture about exactly how closely some of the police were involved in this case, how much covering up went on, and some of the linked cases, such as the current case of Hazel Behan, as she usually say it in Irish, Behan, you may know it there.
but Hazel Bean, who was very savagely by a man on camera in and around Pradelouche, very close to Pradelouche in Portimao, and she was treated appallingly and slut shamed, and you know, the police actually knew. They said to her, "We know who did this," but they didn't help her get the case out. They just ignored her. They treated her like dirt. And other cases the other 5 cases that are due up at some point, we'd hoped it would have been this spring. Looks like it's going to be the autumn now. One of those other cases was a child on a beach who was abused by a man who looked strikingly like Christian Brookner, who the family say is Christian Brookner. And they obviously want to get justice there. Of course, there's the 4 children in the park that were exposed to Christian Brookner at near midnight. Can you imagine the scare of your child being under in a play park, very dark, near midnight, and a man takes his dick out and whatever? And so they want justice, of course. So eventually we'll hopefully see it, but right the way through, it's been slowed down and slowed down and slowed down, and it's a painstaking process. And I'm very pleased to say that, you know, I've got very good access to the police and the judiciary and a lot of the key characters that are in this, and a lot of it's just a sort of slow burn of telling their stories and bringing them together and speaking to them and updating them, and them updating me, and sort of, you know, trying to go forwards as best as possible. But I am confident, despite what you may read in the Sun or the Mail or where, in fact, all the papers recently, that the case is now being dropped and that, you know, he could be out any minute soon. I'm pretty confident that's not the case.
All right, John, going back to the first few days again then. So the McCanns were criticised for their behaviour in the aftermath. Do you think that criticism is valid, or do you think they were in shock and people behave differently in shock, so there's no real yardstick there as to how to judge people?
They were criticised lots of ways. In which particular way are you referring to?
Well, they were criticised for not showing enough emotion, for going out jogging and not, you know, joining the search and things like this. Various criticisms have come to light.
I think it's fair to say, Shaun, that everyone acts differently, and you've got a medical couple, one a fairly senior career doctor, one a GP, and who see and live and breathe death on a daily basis, have to stay strong for their patients, have to handle grief and emotion, that it would be fairly normal for them to want to hold it together and to look, perhaps, I'm sure they looked emotional enough to me when I saw that press conference. They certainly showed a lot of emotion. But yeah, I think why would you need someone to break down on TV to think that they actually showed emotion? I think the criticism was unfair. Yeah, there's some conjecture about leaving your kids in a room and supposedly going backwards and forwards, but, you know, equally all their friends should also be criticised. And, you know, a lot of people did it back then. They don't so much now, do they? And yeah, there were some mistakes made. They'd be the first to admit it. And no, I think it's difficult to criticise them. I think that's a side issue, really.
So in these cases, then, the parents are often on the suspect list. What happened with the Portuguese police and the parents?
Yeah, well, I think they were desperate to find some clues and to actually move forwards. And I think, obviously, logically, everyone would always look at the family in a case like this. It's the most obvious thing you would do. And probably 75% of the time you'd be right, and you would actually find, you know, the perpetrator amongst the family or close friends. But so, you know, it's understandable they would bring the family in for questioning. They would like pick apart their timelines. And, you know, I just think they were naive to think that there was a group of professional doctors that could have been so deceptive and could have been so, you know, I don't know if there was evil, but certainly completely criminal in you know, plotting to protect their friends, if you like. I think that, to me, it seemed fairly obvious, and I think it's obvious to the British government and certainly Operation Grange that they weren't involved, they weren't guilty from the beginning. So I think that what it lost 2 to 3 months of valuable time when they could have been looking for key clues. So I think it actually scuppered the whole investigation by getting very fixated on the McCanns.
What about the allegation that Madeleine was drugged, the cow paw and all that stuff?
They deny it. They said they had used drugs. They said they had them, but they said they hadn't given it to him. And there's no evidence, is there? So, let's just accept it that they didn't drug her.
Why would they have those drugs with them then?
I think everyone used Calpol and things like that, didn't they? Back in the day, I think they still do, to help the kids sleep. Especially if you're a doctor, I think it wouldn't be out of the norm to have certain sleeping drugs or pills. I think it's always a bit of interest in the fact that the two twins, now 18, aren't they? They slept right the way through, apparently, which is amazing. But having had kids of my own, it's amazing, how they can sleep through these sort of things. And once they're asleep, they really are asleep. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not, so I couldn't really comment on that.
All right, so you took us through day one then. What happened on day two?
Gosh, it's 15 years ago, 16 years ago, Shaun. I think I continued to dig on what had sort of going on. I think by end of day two, I think we were starting to be a little bit suspicious of one of the locals, Mr. Murat, who I think he's been exonerated, but I still think he was very suspicious at the time.
What was the suspicion based on?
I think based on his sudden, very deep interest in the case, and the fact that he was very closely linked to the police operation. He was translating a lot for the police. He was bringing a lot of local characters in. He showed a lot of enthusiasm and excitement for the case. Plus, he also coincidentally lived so close and had line of sight of the actual apartment. So I think it would be logical in the way that the police would look at the family. The journalists there would start looking at other people around them as well. So, if you like, that's our job, really, isn't it? As journalists, is to look at all the possibilities and eventualities, which is what I was doing. As you may know, the Sunday Mirror actually did call up the British police in Leicestershire and did report him to the police, who then reported it to the Portuguese police, who then did eventually see fit to arrest Robert Murat. And actually, we didn't run the story first because it was on Sky News and the dailies first. But I think that's, if you like, I think that was fairly responsible reporting, because we were reporting on what we thought was a possibility or a good possibility. What else? I think we also pretty quickly discovered this huge number of a kind of unofficial list of suspects. Sorry, suspects is the wrong word. People who would be on a sex offenders list, or a list of people who would be of interest, maybe a better way of putting it, in that area. Now, if you bear in mind it's a tiny village of 2,000 or 3,000 people, to have a list of up to 600 or 600 and a bit over of people of interest, it's quite staggering. That did, by the way, go to Lagos, which is a little bit further away and has a few more people, but it was a very large, long list of people that supposedly, as you know, had Christian Brookner on it. Supposedly he was visited, but I doubt that happened very much. Particularly because he wasn't actually living at the address supposedly the police had for him at the time. But there were a lot of, so that early on we knew, and we went off to a couple of places that we knew there were various British and German sex offenders. One of being Barão São João, which is about 6 miles away, just outside, and we dug around looking into some of these people and trying to see if there was any, had there been any police interest. Police had been going around, interestingly, knocking on doors and seeing a few people, but nothing came up. So yeah, day 2, day 3, that was a sort of that was this general thing that happened. Then I said I was back in Spain for a few days and came back out again, and it was more digging, and as the case developed.
And what were the police announcing as the case developed?
Very little, incredibly little. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things I found was early on, before I think I probably the first to establish this, was that the main operation was coming out of Portimao, about 20 minutes, half an hour away. And that's where the headquarters were for that side of the Algarve. And there were probably somewhere like 20 or 30 detectives, mostly plainclothes, who were dragged down from Lisbon, Porto, and all up the coast. And they were sort of there to follow leads. But the undeniable thing was that they were hanging around. I kept going there. They all be hanging around. They were sitting there. They were like bored, and they were just like, we've got leads. We want to get on with stuff, but we're not being sent off. And and they were quite friendly with me. And my Portuguese is relatively limited, but I tried to speak to them in Portuguese, or certainly they speak good English, most of them. And it was quite apparent that there wasn't a whole lot of activity going on. There wasn't enough real chasing stuff, and that might be they didn't have that many leads, didn't have that much. So they seem to have the manpower, but not necessarily the guidance or the leads they needed. Because, as you may know, Shaun, that the cameras, for example, on the motorway driving into Spain weren't working, it turned out, and they shut the border, but it was 24 hours later. Now, I got pulled over, ironically, 48 hours later, going back, and was grilled, like went through the boot of my car. And I was just like, I'm a journalist covering this story, and you're around looking into my boot and asking me this and that, So there was lots of mistakes, so many mistakes from the beginning. I mean, frightening large amount.
Do you know how long Murat was held for and why he was cleared?
It wasn't. He was made an arguido. I don't think he was held for that long. I'm going to say I think they kept him up very late at night before they questioned him. They made it really uncomfortable for him, and he was cleared. This is quite good. It's quite interesting. I don't even want to really guess. I'm not sure when he was cleared. I'd say in the first few months, fairly early on.
Who was the next person to be questioned?
The Mccanns were after that. Well, actually, they questioned his Russian friend Sergei Malinka, and they questioned his Murat's girlfriend Michaela, and they were friends. They went to they were both Jehovah's, and weirdly, they'd actually chatted on the night 3 times, various phone calls between the 3 of them, but they didn't remember the phone calls, which was very odd. Which I always think is very suspicious, but to this day hasn't been explained really properly. Around, not long after Madeleine went missing. I'm not interested in pointing the finger at any of them now, but there's certainly still some as you'll find in the book, some kind of questions that haven't been answered on those specific people.
So you said the Mccanns are questioned next, and did they cooperate fully with the police?
I think they did initially. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they did. But there were lots of there were claims that they refused to do an ID parade or go out and do a reconstruction. So I think there were things that the Portuguese would say they didn't do and they didn't help with. I think it was in their interest to help and be as honest as possible. I don't think they had any intention of trying to cover anything up.
And did they have high-level connections with the British government for the British government to get so involved?
No, I don't think so. They had a friend who was a journalist, fairly senior. They were able to get calls in to some of the big media networks, and it was fairly clear the story was going to be huge. So I think it was only fair that the British embassy got involved quickly and came down and gave them some moral support, and also, as you can understand, needed some media backing as well, because there was I think it's hard to. I think you'd struggle. You'd be hard pressed to find, Shaun, a case. At least I can't remember there are many cases. Certainly Diana, but I can't think of many cases going back now where you not only had every single tabloid newspaper, but you had every single broadsheet newspaper, and you had every single TV network, radio stations from the UK, that is, but also from Spain, from Portugal, from America, from France, from Germany. So it's unusual to have something that goes right across the board, from the red tops right the way through to the broadsheets. You know, when you find that someone from the Telegraph, who was an employee of mine for a couple of years, Fiona, was the Telegraph's correspondent for the Spain and Portugal. When you discover that she spent nearly 3 months living in Pradelush through that case, you realise quite how important that case was, how big that case was, and still is. The fact that the Telegraph, which you would think probably they would find other really important stories to cover in Spain and Portugal, was actually based out of Pradelush. Yes, she did. Interestingly, she did go off. She was sent off to Barcelona for a few things. She went off to Ibiza for a couple of stories, went to Mallorca, but she had to fundamentally come back and base herself in Pradelush for the duration until eventually, I think when the Mccanns went back to the UK, that was the point that a lot of the papers pulled out. Although, as you probably know, the Sun and the Mail and the Mirror stayed for nearly a year. And you know, I can give you quite a good idea of what happened, but the truth is that the best people to talk to really would be those 3 or 4 journalists who were there for the first year, who know the ins and outs of the case better than I do. I've interviewed quite a lot for my book, which has helped me pull together, you know, as best as I can, a chronology of what happened in the early days. But I think if you wanted to use my strengths, is what's happened for the last few years, because that's where I've really, you know, lived and breathed it and immersed myself in the case. So, you know, I mean, Mark Williams Thomas, you've probably spoken to, who's now thinks that Christian Brookner's innocent. He was there at the beginning and he studied it at depth. He's a policeman. So, you know, the ins and outs of the evidence, talk to him about it for sure. But, you know, I'll fully admit I'm not the best person on the minutiae of the first year. I did certainly cover it a lot, but maybe slightly on the periphery.
I can't imagine what it must have been like. All those journalists congregated in an area that's, you know, thinly populated. You just every day just waiting for something to break. Was that the atmosphere?
Absolutely horrible, Shaun. Some people love it, but I can tell you it's horrible. There is. Well, I think it was whatever night, must have been the third or second night. It was a Saturday night. There must have been 50 journalists from the UK in a hotel bar. I probably, no exaggeration to say that on one table that I was sitting on with about 5 or 6 of them, there were 14 or 15 full pints of beer. And I mean, talking full pints, you know, because everyone was getting rounds in. Oh, it's my round. I'll get 8 beers. Oh, it's my round. I'll get 8 beers. And, you know, people like me can drink a pint in half an hour. But, you know, so these guys were like, I mean, it was just beyond belief how much alcohol there was. It was like a kind of holiday atmosphere. Everyone was away. And that continued into the early hours. We went back to someone's villa. Things happened that you just shouldn't happen abroad. And I know that the word got back to the news desks and there was some serious ramifications. People were ticked off. Some were dragged back to England. It was a complete bun fight, as we call it in Fleet Street. And as you said, there's a lot of paranoia about, you know, getting the leads. There's also a lot of camaraderie, people helping each other to a certain extent, but there's also a lot of people wanting to kind of work on their own stories and get on with their own stories. It is remarkable. A press pack of that size, rarely will you see nowadays, and certainly not. Can you imagine the investment that the papers would have had to spend on covering that for 2-3 months? You're talking, I'm going to estimate that Telegraph will have spent on Fiona being there nothing short of about 20 or 30,000 euros, renting apartments, going around, food, drink, traveling there to other places. So, yeah. Did they have help? They did have help, yeah. Were they well connected? I don't know. They're reasonably well connected. They're sort of establishment doctors, aren't they? He's a good doctor. He's got a good reputation. They probably had help that, unfortunately, the average working class person may not have had. I don't think the McCanns disguised that. I think they feel they were lucky to have that help. But it backfired in other ways. I think bringing the media storm actually inadvertently may have sealed her daughter's death. So it works 2 ways. And I think they they deserved the help once it got that big. They needed the help, and I don't begrudge them of it, certainly. And I think that a story like this is obviously way out of proportion with other missing children globally. But as they've always said, and they continue to say, and they've pointed out in the book to me, that this brings attention to other missing children and other works globally. And if it, it insists, if it puts it that bit harder and it brings that bit more attention onto these kind of people, then it's not a bad thing.
So during your early stints then, how long were you there for exactly?
As I said, first few days, I think I was there for the first 3 days, then back here in Spain, then back down there for 3 or 4 days, then back in Spain for a week, then went back out again. I'd say I went out 3 or 4 times in the first month, and then I may have gone back again, let's say month 2 for 3 or 4 days or a week. I can't really remember. Is it important?
Were there any other big breaks after Murat?
Certainly did a lot on the Russian guy, Sergei Malenko. It was very interesting.
What was his role? What was his role?
He was just a Russian expat based down there and friends with Murat, as you say, who was made an arguido or a suspect. I think there's questions about his access to homes. They were setting up a state agency. He's an IT guy, knew a lot about computers. So when police raided his place, supposedly various computers that he were looking after got wiped. So you have to make your own conclusions there. And I think he's been exonerated. He came under an enormous amount of pressure from private investigators. You may have heard his car got firebombed. Someone wrote the word "Fala," speak, on the pavement next to his car. He supposedly did. He's written a book, I think. I'm not sure. I've had a little look at it. It's nothing really that interesting in it. So, but he's had a kid now and a wife, so he's getting on with his life. I hope he's all right. It's possible to say. Again, I can only refer you to what I did in it in my book, and really bring this back to who I think is the main suspect here and continues to be the main suspect, and who I think was involved, and that's Christian Brookner.
So when you left the location then, were you watching it from a distance over the years?
Of course, yeah, very much so. Of course, yeah. Anything that broke on Maddie, I was watching. And as I said, quite a few times would be asked to go down to look into something. Or in fact, we got quite a few leads ourselves. I'd actually set up a newspaper called the Olive Press then, and it's still going today. And so we cover the Iberian Peninsula. So we got a lot of leads and calls. We spoke to quite a lot of people on the ground in Portugal, and so I quite often went over to Portugal and other stories, as well as the Madeleine case, and that meant, I kind of kept close contact with what was happening there. But yeah, very interested. So I guess you could say I was fascinated with the case and everything that happened. Anything that happened in the case, I would, be really interested in, particularly, primarily looking for a Spanish angle. So if there was no Spanish angle, is sort of marginal for our readers. I tried to make sure that our readers had things that were relevant to Spain or Andalusia in particular, which is where we're based.
And what were the most interesting leads?
Well, we had various sightings around Nerja, west of Malaga, were very interesting. That kept sort of popping up. There was an interesting one of supposedly a businessman on a plane in Ibiza, which we had a good look at. And then there was a fascinating lead from an Angolan basketball player who had moved to Huelva and claimed that he had to live in Huelva, which is across the Portuguese border, on the way to Seville, the nearest part of Spain to Portugal. He claimed that he'd worked he worked in nightclubs, and he worked for people who ran nightclubs in and around Faro and along the Algarve, and that he knew the people who ran these clubs were people who kidnapped children and sexually abused children. And he claimed that Maddie was one of the children who'd been snatched to order, and she'd been basically taken by this gang. And he then weirdly said he thought she would ended up in America, which was a really odd line. But what was really interesting about this guy was that he wasn't looking for publicity, really. He'd actually, what is most interesting was that he hired a lawyer and he'd gone to the local police in Huelva to investigate it. And of course, typically the national police in Huelva decided straight away, oh no, they sent all the information over to the police in Portugal. And I think that immediately got squashed and they just lost interest. So then we put him in touch with Operation Grange and the Mccanns. And then at the time they were very interested in what he had to say, and they actually came down and spoke to him. The weird thing is he's vanished off the face of the earth, and it's just really strange. Like the 6'6" Angolan basketball player can just vanish off the face of the earth. It's just really strange. It's one of those horrible things. I just my mind, I really fear for the guy, actually, if I'm being honest. He knew these people, and he claimed at the time that one of his own family members had been snatched by this gang. So Shaun, that really fascinated me. I mean, I did that story for us, and it then ended up in the front page of the Sun. Such was the interest of the Madeleine case at the time. But you look back and you think, God, does this guy really? He actually gave me the names of these people. And again, we ran it up the flagpole, and I haven't put them in my book for legal reasons. But what he's saying is entirely credible, and entirely believable when you bear in mind the sort of investigations that Operation Grange and the BK in Germany have been doing over the last few years.
Yeah, and that was the path that David Icke took me down as well. So you said there were various sightings. How often were the sightings getting reported to you, and how did you discern whether they were credible or not?
Jesus, yeah, there were lots. There were lots of them. I mean, initially, just everything you looked into. I mean, there was one amazing one where a campsite had some German visitors in a combi van, and they'd arrived at a campsite in Mccann, and they checked in, and they'd booked previously for 2 adults and 2 children. They turned up with a third child who was Maddie's age, that looked tired and, looked groggy. And it was the day or 2 days after, she'd gone missing. So you can imagine, we were like, we solved the case here. And we got down to the campsite, and then they got in the visitors book, and there wasn't a third child's name in there. And, then we traced this family back to Germany, and we actually got one of the German newspapers to go. I probably should have got myself. I wish I had, but actually, it didn't make any difference in the end, because the German newspaper went for us, knocked on the door, and discovered that yes, they had been there, and they did actually have a third child, but for some reason there'd been a translation error and they hadn't put it in, and there was the third child. And yes, she was about the same age as Madeleine, and she did look fairly similar. It's one of those, and it took us 2 weeks perhaps to really dig into that, but that's one of those things, those rabbit holes that you go down to, and one of these cases are when you're doing a crime book, right?
Yeah, and with the sightings, were people reporting the unique colour on the eye?
No, not. They weren't. The colombona.
Yeah.
No, they weren't. No. But that girl in America recently supposedly had one, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. Yeah, we did quite a bit on her as well recently. Yeah,
that was a massive thing, wasn't it?
When she first announced that, what did you think?
I didn't believe it. Although I would say within 5 minutes, didn't believe it. And I went through my sources with Madeleine family, and it was straight away they just said, look, it's not her. And but so had to go up the flagpole a bit, but so I did the bare modicum of checks, and it was just clear it wasn't her. And we didn't even write anything, and didn't run a single word about it, just because what's the point? I'm trying not to kind of do anything that's just sensational for the sake of it. I mean, you may have seen we did a story a month ago just explaining that the case isn't dead, it isn't leaving Braunschweig court, it's going to rumble on, but we're just trying to correct what's out there and try and do it as clearly and correctly as possible. You know, there's a lot of clickbait out there. We've got a paywall now, so we just want quality people who sign up to us and use us. So it's not about sensational journalism and trying to get people just to watch, to read stuff. We want people to want to read it and read it for a reason. So we did something about Maddie's being 18. That seemed appropriate. But yeah, I think I find it amazing that, you know, that you'll have a story in a, say, the Mirror or the Sun or the Mail, and within an hour it's in all the other papers and the Star just regurgitated, and just think. But yeah, that was a remarkably odd case, wasn't it? That girl, she's a strange girl, wasn't she?